The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Sarah Ghost Martinez adjusted her helmet inside the F-22 Raptor cockpit. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but today felt different. The radio crackled, with urgent chatter from ground control about a SEAL team that had gone silent 12 hours ago. Meanwhile, deep in enemy territory, Staff Sergeant Mike Torres pressed his back against the cold rock wall of a cave. His team of 6 Navy SEALs had been compromised during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. The Taliban fighters had surrounded their position just after midnight, and now they were trapped with limited ammunition and no way to call for help. Torres looked at his wounded teammate, Petty Officer Jackson, who was losing blood from a shrapnel wound in his leg. The medic, Rodriguez, had done what he could, but they needed immediate evacuation. The problem was their radio had been damaged in the initial firefight and their GPS beacon was barely functioning. "Sir, we've got movement on the ridge," whispered Corporal Bennett, pointing toward the eastern slope. Through his binoculars, Torres could see at least 20 Taliban fighters positioning themselves with rocket-propelled grenades. They were preparing for a final assault that would wipe out the entire SEAL team. The cave they had found offered some protection, but it was also a trap. There was only one entrance, and the enemy knew exactly where they were. Torres calculated they had maybe 2 hours before the Taliban would launch their attack. His team had fought in dozens of operations, but this time felt hopeless. Back at Bagram Airfield, Sarah received her mission briefing. Intelligence had picked up emergency signals from a SEAL team somewhere in the Kunar province. The signals were weak and intermittent, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint their exact location. Several rescue helicopters had been shot down, trying to reach other teams in the same area over the past month. "The mountain terrain makes helicopter rescue extremely dangerous," explained Colonel Anderson during the briefing. "We need air support to clear the area first, but we're not even sure where they are exactly." Sarah studied the topographical map spread across the table. The Kunar province was known as one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan. The mountains provided perfect cover for enemy fighters, and the narrow valleys made air support difficult. Most pilots avoided the area unless absolutely necessary. "What's the timeline, sir?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. "Unknown," the colonel replied grimly. "We lost contact with them at 0200 hours. If they're still alive, they won't be for much longer." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. 6 American soldiers were counting on her, even though they didn't know she existed. She had joined the Air Force to make a difference, and today, that difference might mean life or death for a SEAL team. As she walked toward her aircraft, Sarah thought about her training. She had graduated top of her class from pilot training and had flown over 50 combat missions without losing a single ground team. But this mission was different. The enemy controlled the territory, the weather was deteriorating, and she would be flying alone into one of the most dangerous areas in Afghanistan. The F-22 Raptor was the most advanced fighter jet in the world, but even its sophisticated systems couldn't guarantee success in this situation. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist, knowing that every decision she made in the next few hours could determine whether 6 American heroes made it home alive. Torres checked his watch again. The Taliban fighters were getting closer, and their shouts echoed off the mountain walls. He knew they were planning something big. His team had enough ammunition for maybe 30 minutes of sustained fighting, but against 20 or more enemies with superior positioning, their chances were almost zero. "Listen up," Torres whispered to his team. "We all know how this looks, but we've been in tough spots before and we've always found a way out. Keep your heads up and stay ready. Help might be coming." Even as he said the words, Torres wasn't sure he believed them. But as a leader, his job was to keep his men fighting until the very end. Somewhere above the clouds, Sarah was preparing to prove that help was indeed on the way. Sarah's F-22 Raptor cut through the morning sky at 30,000 feet, its engines humming with deadly precision. She had been searching the Kunar province for 40 minutes, using every sensor available to locate the missing SEAL team. The terrain below looked like a maze of rocky peaks and deep valleys, perfect for hiding but terrible for rescue operations. Her radar picked up multiple aircraft in the area, mostly enemy helicopters and some older fighter jets that the Taliban had somehow acquired. Sarah knew she was outnumbered, but the F-22's stealth capabilities gave her a significant advantage. The enemy couldn't see her coming until it was too late. "Ghost, this is command," crackled the radio. "We're picking up very weak emergency signals from grid reference 3472. Can you investigate?" Sarah banked her aircraft toward the coordinates. The signal was coming from a narrow valley surrounded by high peaks. As she descended to get a better look, her threat detection system started beeping. Enemy surface-to-air missiles were locking onto her position. Down in the cave, Torres heard the distinctive sound of jet engines overhead. For a moment, hope flickered in his chest. But then he remembered that the Taliban also had aircraft. He peered out of the cave entrance and saw 3 enemy helicopters circling like vultures, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "That's not one of ours," muttered Rodriguez, the team medic, as he continued treating Jackson's wound. "Sounds too heavy to be American." Torres nodded grimly. The situation was getting worse by the minute. Through his binoculars, he could see Taliban fighters moving rocket launchers into position. They were planning to blast the cave entrance and finish off the SEAL team once and for all. "Sir, Jackson's losing a lot of blood," Rodriguez reported quietly. "He needs real medical attention within the next hour, or he's not going to make it." The weight of command pressed down on Torres like a boulder. Every decision he made affected the lives of his 5 teammates. They had families waiting for them back home, children who expected their fathers to return safely. Torres couldn't let them down. High above, Sarah spotted the enemy helicopters through her targeting system. They were old Soviet-era aircraft, but they carried enough firepower to level a small building. More importantly, they were hovering directly over the area where the emergency signals were strongest. "That's got to be them," Sarah said to herself, switching her weapon systems to active mode. The F-22 carried 6 air-to-air missiles and a cannon with 480 rounds. Against 3 helicopters and unknown ground forces, she would need to use every shot carefully. Sarah dove toward the valley, her aircraft screaming through the thin mountain air. The enemy helicopters didn't detect her approach until she was already within firing range. Her first missile struck the lead helicopter, sending it spinning into the mountainside in a ball of orange flame. The explosion echoed through the valley, like thunder. Torres and his team felt the ground shake as burning debris rained down from the sky. Through the cave opening, they could see 1 enemy helicopter destroyed, and 2 others frantically searching for the attacker they couldn't see. "Was that one of ours?" asked Bennett, hope creeping into his voice for the first time in hours. Torres studied the sky through his binoculars. He couldn't see any aircraft, but the enemy helicopters were clearly under attack from something. American. Pilots had a distinctive way of fighting, precise, calculated, and deadly effective. This felt like American firepower. Sarah lined up her second shot as the remaining helicopters tried to escape the valley. Her missile struck the second aircraft, just as it cleared the ridgeline. The helicopter crashed in a spectacular explosion that could be seen for miles. The third helicopter pilot, realizing he was facing an invisible enemy, fled toward the Pakistani border. But Sarah's problems were just beginning. Her attack had revealed her position to the ground-based missile sites scattered throughout the mountains. Suddenly, her threat detection system lit up like a Christmas tree. At least 6 different missile batteries were trying to lock onto her aircraft. "Ghost, this is command. We're showing multiple SAM sites activating in your area. Recommend immediate egress." Sarah ignored the order. She had found the SEAL team and she wasn't leaving without them. But first, she needed to deal with the surface-to-air missiles that were now streaking toward her position like deadly fireworks. The F-22's advanced countermeasures kicked in automatically, deploying chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missiles. Sarah pulled her aircraft into a violent climbing turn, using the mountains themselves as cover. 3 missiles exploded harmlessly against the rock faces, but more were coming. In the cave, Torres watched the aerial battle unfolding above there. Heads. Missiles crisscrossed the sky while an invisible aircraft dodged between the peaks with impossible precision. Whoever was flying that plane was either extremely skilled or completely crazy. "That pilot's got some serious skills," Rodriguez observed, temporarily forgetting about his wounded patient as he watched the show. Torres couldn't argue. The pilot was single-handedly taking on an entire enemy air defense network to protect a SEAL team they had probably never met. It was the kind of selfless heroism that defined the American military. Sarah's fuel gauge was dropping rapidly as she continued her evasive maneuvers. She had maybe 15 minutes of flying time left before she would be forced to return to base. But the SEAL team was still trapped, and the Taliban ground forces were regrouping for another assault. She had to find a way to extract the team, or at least buy them enough time for a rescue helicopter to reach their position. The problem was that every helicopter pilot in Afghanistan knew the Kunar province was a death trap. Sarah was going to have to get creative. Sarah's mind raced as she dodged another surface-to-air missile. The explosion behind her F-22 shook the aircraft, but the advanced fighter held together. She needed to establish communication with the SEAL team below, but her radio wasn't designed for ground-to-air contact at close range. The solution came to her in a flash of inspiration. She switched to the emergency frequency that all special operations teams monitored and began broadcasting in the clear. Any American ground units in the Kunar province, this is Ghost in the F-22 overhead. If you can hear me, signal your position with a mirror or any reflective surface. In the cave, Torres nearly dropped his binoculars when he heard the transmission. The voice was calm, professional, and undeniably American. More importantly, it was female, which meant this was no ordinary pilot. Very few women flew combat missions in F-22s, and those who did were among the best pilots in the Air Force. "Rodriguez, give me your signal mirror," Torres ordered, his voice tight with excitement. The medic pulled a small survival mirror from his kit and handed it to his team leader. Torres crawled to the cave entrance and angled the mirror toward the sky. The morning sun caught the surface and sent a brilliant flash of light bouncing off the mountain peaks. High above, Sarah's keen eyes caught the glint of reflected sunlight from the valley floor. "I see you," she radioed back. "6 souls on board?" "Affirmative," Torres replied into his backup radio, which he had managed to repair during the night. "1 urgent medical. We're surrounded and running low on ammunition." Sarah felt her heart sink. The SEAL team was in even worse shape than she had thought. Jackson's medical condition meant they couldn't wait for a standard rescue operation. They needed immediate extraction, but the valley was still crawling with Taliban fighters. "Ghost, be advised," Torres continued. "We count approximately 20 enemy fighters with RPGs and automatic weapons. They've got us pinned down in a cave on the eastern wall of the valley." Sarah pulled up her tactical display and studied the terrain. The cave was positioned perfectly for defense but impossible for helicopter extraction. The narrow valley walls would make it almost impossible for a rescue aircraft to hover safely while the team boarded. "Copy that. I'm going to try something," Sarah replied. "When I give the word, you and your team need to move to the valley floor. There's a flat area about 200 meters south of your position." Torres looked at his wounded teammate. Jackson was conscious but barely hanging on. Moving him 200 meters under enemy fire would be dangerous, but staying in the cave meant certain death when the Taliban launched their final assault. "Roger, Ghost. We'll be ready to move on your signal." Sarah climbed to 15,000 feet and began planning her attack. The Taliban fighters were spread out across the ridgeline, using the rocky terrain for cover. Her cannon held 480 rounds of 20mm ammunition, each capable of destroying a small building. She would need every shot. She dove toward the valley at nearly the speed of sound, her targeting computer identifying enemy positions faster than any human could track them. The first burst from her cannon sent a line of explosions marching across the eastern ridge, where most of the Taliban fighters were concentrated. The sound was deafening. Torres and his team felt the mountain itself shake as 20mm rounds exploded all around the enemy positions. Rocks and debris rained down into the valley as Sarah's cannon systematically destroyed every Taliban fighting position she could identify. "Move now," Sarah commanded over the radio as she pulled out of her attack run. Torres grabbed Jackson under one arm while Rodriguez took the other. The rest of the team formed a protective circle around their wounded teammate as they stumbled out of the cave and began the desperate dash across the valley floor. Enemy fighters who had survived Sarah's attack opened fire from their remaining positions. Bullets sparked off the rocks around the running SEALs as they fought their way toward the extraction point. Bennett returned fire with his rifle, trying to keep the enemy heads down. Sarah banked hard and came in for another strafing run. This time she focused on the western ridge where muzzle flashes indicated surviving Taliban positions. Her cannon carved deep gouges in the mountainside as she systematically eliminated each threat, but her fuel was running dangerously low. The F-22's fuel gauge showed less than 10 minutes of flying time remaining. Sarah had to make a choice: return to base and refuel, or stay and protect the SEAL team until the very last drop of fuel was gone. "Ghost, this is command," her radio crackled. "You are ordered to return to base immediately. Your fuel state is critical." Sarah looked down at the 6 American soldiers fighting for their lives in the valley below. Jackson had collapsed twice during the run to the extraction point, and the team was still taking heavy fire from concealed positions. "Negative, command," Sarah replied firmly. "I have Americans in contact. I'm staying until they're safe." Torres and his team finally reached the flat area Sarah had identified. It was about the size of a basketball court, carved into the valley floor by centuries of erosion. Jackson was barely conscious, his face pale from blood loss. "We're in position," Torres radioed. "But I don't see how any helicopter can get in here with those mountains on all sides." Sarah was thinking the same thing. The valley walls rose almost vertically for 3,000 feet. Any helicopter trying to descend would be a sitting duck for the remaining Taliban fighters. But she had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. "Copy that," Sarah replied. "I'm calling in a special extraction team. Hold your position and keep Jackson alive." What Torres didn't know was that Sarah wasn't calling in anyone. She was about to attempt something that had never been tried before in combat: using an F-22 Raptor as a personal escort for a helicopter rescue in the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. Her fuel gauge continued to drop as enemy fighters regrouped on the ridgelines. Sarah had maybe 5 minutes of flying time left, and the nearest rescue helicopter was still 20 minutes away. The numbers didn't add up, but Sarah had never been good at math anyway. She was about to prove that sometimes courage and skill could overcome impossible odds. Sarah's hands moved quickly across her control panel as she switched to the emergency rescue frequency. "Dustoff 7-3, this is Ghost. I have 6 American souls in need of immediate extraction. Grid reference 3472, valley floor." The response came back immediately. "Ghost, this is Dustoff 7-3. That's a negative on extraction. The LZ is too hot, and we've lost 2 birds in that area already this month." Captain Jake Dustoff Wilson had been flying rescue helicopters for 8 years. His UH-60 Black Hawk had saved hundreds of American lives, but he wasn't about to sacrifice his crew for a mission that looked impossible. The Kunar province was known as the helicopter graveyard for good reason. "Dustoff, I understand your concern," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her dropping fuel gauge. "But I can provide top cover and suppress enemy fire during your approach." Jake almost laughed at the suggestion. One F-22, even with a skilled pilot, couldn't protect a slow-moving helicopter from every Taliban fighter in the mountains. It was a suicide mission disguised as a rescue attempt. Down in the valley, Torres could hear enemy voices getting closer. The Taliban fighters were regrouping and moving toward their position. Jackson's breathing had become shallow, and his skin felt cold to the touch. The medic Rodriguez was doing everything possible, but they needed a real hospital. "Ghost, we've got movement on all sides," Torres reported. "I don't think we can hold this position much longer." Sarah looked at her fuel gauge one more time. 4 minutes of flying time left. She made a decision that went against every regulation in the Air Force manual. "Dustoff 7-3, I'm declaring a tactical emergency. Those men will die without immediate extraction." There was silence on the radio for several seconds. Jake Wilson was weighing his options. He had a crew of 4 men depending on his judgment, but 6 Navy SEALs were counting on his courage. Finally, he keyed his microphone. "Roger, Ghost. Dustoff 7-3 is inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She had just committed a helicopter crew to a rescue mission with only 4 minutes of fuel remaining in her own aircraft. If her F-22 ran out of fuel before the helicopter arrived, 6 SEALs and 4 aircrew would likely die in the next hour. She climbed to 8,000 feet and began her final attack run. Every remaining round of ammunition had to count. Her targeting Computer identified 12 Taliban positions scattered across the ridgeline surrounding the valley. The cannon roared to life, sending a stream of 20mm rounds into the mountainside. Each explosion sent chunks of rock and metal flying through the air as Taliban fighters scrambled for better cover. Sarah worked methodically from east to west, destroying every enemy position her sensors could detect. Torres watched the aerial display with professional admiration. The F-22 pilot was conducting a textbook close air support mission despite being critically low on fuel and outnumbered 50-1. Whoever was flying that aircraft had nerves of steel. "Sir, I can see the helicopter," Bennett shouted, pointing toward the northern end of the valley. Jake Wilson pushed his UH-60 Blackhawk through the mountain passes at maximum speed. His crew chief and door gunners were checking their weapons and preparing for the most dangerous pickup of their careers. Everyone knew the odds were against them, but that's why they had volunteered for rescue duty. 2 minutes out, Jake radioed to Sarah. "How's your fuel looking, Ghost?" Sarah glanced at her gauge. The needle was touching empty, and her engine warning lights were starting to flash. In 60 seconds, her F-22 would begin its automatic fuel conservation mode, which would severely limit her ability to maneuver. "I've got enough," Sarah lied smoothly. "Focus on the pickup." Her cannon fired its last burst just as the helicopter appeared in the valley. The Blackhawk dropped between the mountain peaks like a stone, its rotors kicking up clouds of dust and debris as Jake brought it into a hover over the SEAL team. Taliban fighters who had survived Sarah's attacks opened fire on the rescue helicopter. Bullets sparked off its armored hull as the crew chief kicked out fast ropes for the SEALs to climb aboard. But Jackson was too weak to climb, and the team would have to carry him up. "We need a basket for the wounded man," Torres shouted over the roar of the helicopter's engines. The crew chief lowered a rescue basket on a steel cable. Rodriguez and Bennett carefully loaded Jackson into the basket while the rest of the team provided covering fire. Enemy rounds were getting closer, and one of them shattered the helicopter's side window. Sarah's fuel warning alarm began beeping insistently. Her F-22 was running on fumes, but the extraction was only half complete. She made one final dive toward the ridgeline, using her aircraft's engine noise and intimidation factor to keep enemy heads down. The psychological effect worked. Taliban fighters ducked for cover as the F-22 screamed overhead at barely subsonic speed. It bought the rescue team precious seconds to get Jackson into the helicopter and begin loading the rest of the SEALs. Torres was the last man on the ground. As team leader, he wouldn't leave until all his men were safe. The rescue basket came, down one final time, and Torres grabbed the cable just as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the mountainside 50 meters away. "Go, go, go!" Torres shouted as he was hauled into the helicopter. Jake Wilson didn't need to be told twice. He pulled maximum power and climbed straight up, using the mountain walls for protection as they cleared the valley. In the back of the aircraft, Rodriguez was working frantically to stabilize Jackson with the helicopter's medical equipment. Sarah watched the Blackhawk disappear safely over the ridgeline before her F-22's engines finally began to sputter. Her fuel was completely exhausted, and the closest friendly airfield was still 10 minutes away. She had saved 6 American lives, but now she faced the very real possibility of crashing in enemy territory. Her radio crackled one final time. "Ghost, this is Dustoff 7-3. All 6 souls on board and secure. Jackson's vitals are stabilizing. You saved our lives today." Sarah smiled grimly as her engines continued to lose power. She had accomplished her mission, but her own survival was now very much in doubt. The mountains of Afghanistan stretched endlessly in all directions, and she was gliding toward them in a $20 million fighter jet that was about to become the world's most expensive paperweight. Sarah's F-22 Raptor was now a glider, cutting through the thin mountain air with deadly silence. Her engines had completely shut down, and the only sounds in the cockpit were the whisper of wind over the aircraft's surfaces and the steady beeping of warning alarms. She had maybe 3 minutes before she would be forced to eject over Taliban-controlled territory. Her training kicked in automatically. Sarah ran through emergency procedures while scanning the terrain below for any possible landing site. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, their rocky peaks offering no hope for a safe landing. Her best option was to fly the aircraft as far toward friendly territory as possible before ejecting. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Ghost," she transmitted on the emergency frequency. F-22 flame out, fuel exhaustion, currently gliding at 12,000 feet, 15 miles northeast of Bagram. Pilot preparing to eject. The response from Bagram Tower came immediately. "Ghost, this is Bagram Control. We copy your mayday. Search and rescue is launching immediately. Can you make it to the emergency strip at Forward Operating Base Chapman?" Sarah pulled up her navigation display and calculated the distance. FOB Chapman was a small American outpost built on a plateau 20 miles to the south. The runway was short and surrounded by mountains, but it was her only chance of landing the F-22 instead of abandoning it. "Negative," Sarah replied after doing the math. "I don't have the altitude to reach Chapman, preparing to punch out in 60 seconds. She began the ejection sequence, checking her survival gear and preparing mentally for what would happen next. If she survived the ejection, she would be alone in enemy territory with only a pistol, some emergency rations, and a radio. The Taliban would be searching for her within minutes. But as Sarah reached for the ejection handle, an idea struck her. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might work. Instead of ejecting over the mountains, she could try to stretch her, glide by using the mountain winds and thermal currents. She had learned about mountain flying during her training in Colorado. The peaks created updrafts and downdrafts that skilled pilots could use to extend their range. It was risky with a powered aircraft and almost impossible with a dead-stick glider, but Sarah had run out of conventional options. Bagram Control. Ghost is attempting an extended glide using mountain thermals. Do not launch search and rescue until I call for them. Ghost? That's not advisable, came the worried reply. Recommend immediate ejection while you're still over unpopulated terrain. Sarah ignored the advice and banked her aircraft toward a steep mountain face where she could see clouds forming, a sure sign of rising air currents. The F-22 responded sluggishly without engine power, but its aerodynamic design was still working in her favor. As she approached the mountain face, Sarah felt the aircraft suddenly lift as it caught an updraft. Her altitude, which had been dropping steadily, suddenly stabilized and then began to increase. She had found a thermal current strong enough to keep her 30,000-pound fighter aircraft aloft. "I'll be damned," Sarah muttered to herself as she watched her altimeter climb. "It's actually working." She spent the next 10 minutes riding mountain thermals from peak to peak, like a massive eagle soaring through the Hindu Kush. Each thermal gave her a few hundred feet of altitude and extended her range toward friendly territory. It was the most challenging flying of her career, requiring split-second timing and perfect coordination. Meanwhile, at Bagram Airfield, every pilot and ground crew member was following Sarah's progress on radar. Her aircraft appeared as a slow-moving blip, weaving between mountain peaks at impossibly low altitude. Everyone knew they were witnessing either a miracle or a disaster in progress. Colonel Anderson stood in the control tower, watching his best pilot attempt something that wasn't in any manual. "She's either crazy or brilliant," he muttered to the air traffic controller. "Maybe both, sir," came the reply. Sarah caught her fourth thermal just as her altimeter showed 8,000 feet. She was now within gliding range of several small valleys that might offer landing opportunities. Through her canopy, she could see a narrow river valley with what looked like a relatively flat section along the water. "Bagram Control. I have a possible landing site in sight. Small valley, approximately 10 miles your bearing 180. Preparing for emergency landing." The response was immediate and urgent. "Ghost, negative. That valley is not secure. Heavy Taliban presence reported in that area within the last 24 hours. Sarah looked at her options one more time. She could continue gliding and hope to find a better landing site. Or she could try to put the F-22 down in the river valley and take her chances with Taliban fighters. Her altitude was dropping again, and she was running out of mountain thermals to ride. "Roger, Bagram. I copy heavy Taliban presence, but it's either land in the valley or punch out over the same territory. At least if I land the aircraft, I'll have some protection and maybe working radios." Sarah lined up her approach to the valley, using every bit of skill she had learned in 10 years of flying. The F-22 had never been designed for off-field landings. but its strong landing gear and robust construction gave her a fighting chance. The valley floor rushed up to meet her as she flared the aircraft for landing. The F-22 touched down hard on the rocky ground, bounced twice, and then settled into a ground roll that seemed to last forever. Sarah stood on the brakes, using every technique she knew to stop the aircraft before it ran into the mountains at the far end of the valley. Finally, with less than 100 yards to spare, the F-22 Raptor came to a complete stop. Sarah sat in the cockpit for a moment, hardly believing she was alive. She had just accomplished something that would be talked about in pilot training schools for decades to come. But her celebration was short-lived. Through her canopy, she could see dust clouds in the distance, vehicles approaching her position at high speed. The Taliban had heard her aircraft land, and they were coming to investigate. Sarah quickly began destroying sensitive equipment and preparing to defend herself with whatever weapons she could find. Her radio crackled one final time with a transmission from Bagram. "Ghost, we show you on the ground. Search and rescue is inbound, but they're 20 minutes out. Can you hold your position?" Sarah chambered a round in her service pistol and checked her survival gear one more time. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours if she was facing a dozen Taliban fighters with automatic weapons. "Roger, Bagram," Sarah replied with more confidence than she felt. "Ghost is on the ground and ready for pickup. I'll try to keep the welcoming committee busy until you arrive." Sarah climbed out of her F-22 cockpit and immediately took cover behind the aircraft's landing gear. The approaching dust clouds were getting closer, and she could hear the sound of truck engines echoing off the valley walls. She had maybe 5 minutes before the Taliban fighters reached her position. Her survival training kicked in as she quickly assessed her situation. The F-22 provided excellent cover, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. Her service pistol held 15 rounds, and she had 2 spare magazines. Against a dozen or more enemy fighters with assault rifles, that wouldn't last long. Sarah activated her survival radio and began transmitting her exact coordinates to the incoming rescue team. "Rescue 1-1, this is Ghost. I'm on the ground at grid 3497. Multiple enemy vehicles approaching from the north. Estimate 10 to 15 fighters inbound." The response came from Captain Mike Rescue Thompson, flying the lead UH-60 Blackhawk in a 2-ship formation. "Copy, Ghost. We're 15 minutes out with 2 birds and a full complement of door gunners. Try to stay alive until we get there." Sarah almost smiled, despite her desperate situation. Military humor never changed, no matter how bad things got. She checked her pistol one more time and waited for the enemy to arrive. The first Taliban truck came around the bend in the valley at high speed, followed closely by 2 more vehicles filled with armed fighters. They stopped about 200 yards from the F-22, probably suspicious of booby traps or hidden American soldiers. Through her binoculars, Sarah watched the enemy fighters dismount from their vehicles and begin spreading out in a wide semicircle. They were being careful, which was smart tactics but also bought her precious time. The longer they took to organize their assault, the better her chances of survival. One of the Taliban leaders began shouting orders in Pashto while pointing toward the aircraft. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Capture the American pilot alive if possible. A female F-22 pilot would be a valuable prisoner for propaganda purposes. Sarah keyed her radio. "Bagram Control, this is Ghost. I count 14 enemy fighters moving to surround my position. They appear to want me alive, which might work in my favor." Back at Bagram Airfield, Colonel Anderson was coordinating the rescue effort while monitoring Sarah's situation. 2 Apache gunships were being scrambled to provide additional fire support, and a quick reaction force was being loaded into helicopters for immediate deployment. "Ghost, this is Colonel Anderson," he transmitted personally. "You've already done the impossible today. Just hold on for 10 more minutes and we'll have you out of there." Sarah appreciated the personal call from her commander, but she knew the next 10 minutes would determine whether she lived to see another day. The Taliban fighters were moving closer, using rocks and small bushes for cover as they advanced on her position. She waited until they were within 50 yards before firing her first shot. The bullet struck the lead fighter center mass, dropping him instantly and causing the others to dive for cover. Sarah immediately shifted position, using the F-22's landing gear and fuselage to stay protected. The enemy fighters returned fire with automatic weapons, their bullets sparking off the aircraft's armored surfaces. Sarah was grateful for the F-22's tough construction. The fighter jet was built to survive combat damage and was providing excellent protection. She fired 3 more carefully aimed shots, forcing the Taliban fighters to keep their heads down and disrupting their coordinated advance. But her ammunition was limited, and they would eventually figure out that she was alone. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley as the rescue flight approached from the south. Sarah could see 2 Black Hawks flying low between the mountain peaks, their door gunners already preparing to engage the enemy fighters. "Ghost, this is Rescue 1-1. We have eyes on your position, keeping your heads down in 5 seconds. Sarah pressed herself against the F-22's landing gear as the first Black Hawk roared overhead. The door gunners opened fire with their M240 machine guns, sending streams of tracer rounds into the Taliban positions. The effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy fighters who had been advancing confidently just seconds before were now scrambling for better cover as 7.62mm rounds chewed up the rocky ground around them. Several Taliban fighters were hit in the initial burst, and the rest retreated toward their vehicles. "Ghost, this is Rescue 1-1, Captain Thompson radioed. "We're setting down 50 meters to your south. When I give the word, run for the helicopter and don't look back." Sarah gathered her survival gear and prepared to make the most important sprint of her life. The second Black Hawk was circling overhead, its gunners keeping the Taliban fighters pinned down with continuous suppressive fire. But she knew the enemy would regroup quickly once they realized what was happening. "Go, go, go!" Thompson shouted over the radio. Sarah broke cover and ran toward the rescue helicopter with everything she had. Behind her, she could hear Taliban fighters shouting and the distinctive crack of AK-47 assault rifles. Bullets whined through the air around her, but the covering fire from the circling Black Hawk kept most of the enemy heads down. 50 meters had never seemed so far. Sarah's legs pumped as she sprinted across the rocky valley floor, her survival gear bouncing with each step. The Black Hawk's crew chief was hanging out of the aircraft, gesturing frantically for her to hurry. 20 meters from the helicopter, Sarah felt a bullet tug at her flight suit. Another round sparked off a rock just inches from her feet. The Taliban fighters were getting more accurate as they overcame their initial shock. "Almost there!" the crew chief shouted, reaching out to grab Sarah as she dove for the helicopters. "Cargo bay." Strong hands pulled her into the aircraft just as Captain Thompson lifted off. The Black Hawk climbed rapidly, using the valley walls for protection while the second helicopter continued to suppress enemy fire. Within seconds, they were clear of the valley and flying toward friendly territory. Sarah lay on the helicopter floor, breathing hard and hardly believing she was alive. The crew chief handed her a bottle of water and checked her for injuries. Aside from a few scratches and bruises, she was unharmed. "Ma'am, I've got to say," the crew chief shouted over the engine noise, "that was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. Nobody's ever dead-sticked an F-22 before, and nobody's ever used mountain thermals to extend a glide like that." Sarah managed a tired smile. "Just glad it worked. How are the SEALs we pulled out earlier?" "All 6 made it back safe," Thompson replied from the pilot's seat. "Jackson's in surgery right now, but the docs say he's going to make it. Your actions today saved 7 American lives, counting your own." As they flew back toward Bagram Airfield, Sarah thought about the events of the past few hours. She had started the day as just another pilot on just another mission, but sometimes ordinary people were called upon to do extraordinary things. The radio crackled with a transmission from Colonel Anderson. "Ghost, this is Command. Outstanding work today. The entire Air Force is going to hear about what you accomplished." Sarah keyed her microphone one last time. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my job." But everyone who heard that transmission knew it was much more than just doing a job. Sarah Martinez had proven that courage, skill, and determination could overcome impossible odds. Her actions would become legend in military aviation circles, inspiring future generations of pilots to never give up, even when all hope seemed lost. 3 months later, Sarah received the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony attended by the 6 Navy SEALs she had saved. Staff Sergeant Torres presented her with a gift from his team, a small piece of metal recovered from the cave where they had been trapped. "This is from the mountainside where you first saved our lives," Torres explained. "We wanted you to have something to remember that day." Sarah accepted the gift with genuine emotion. The rescue mission had changed all of their lives in ways they were still discovering. Jackson had made a full recovery and was back on duty. The helicopter crews had been decorated for valor, and the entire incident had become a case study in joint operations. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was simple. 7 American servicemen had gone home to their families. In the end, that was what really mattered. That was why she had joined the Air Force, and that was why she would continue flying missions wherever her country needed her. The mountains of Afghanistan were far behind her now, but the lessons learned in that valley would stay with her forever. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by armies, but by individuals who refuse to give up when others are counting on them. Sarah Martinez had proven that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes the most unlikely person becomes exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. The 6 Navy SEALs who owe their lives to her courage would never forget the day a female F-22 pilot stepped in when they had no hope left.